How has the most connected society in history also become the loneliest? It's easy to forget how far we've come. In just a matter of years, we've gone from phone calls to text messages to video chat. In an instant, we can ring up a family member across the world and feel more connected with them, given the distance, than we could have at any other point in history. This was science fiction in the 20th century.
Hello.
It's during that same period of innovation that brought us one-click shopping, anything we could need delivered to our door the same day. And so we bought and stored and used and replaced. A generation living better than Louis XIV, yet finding ourselves more secluded than ever. Why do people, even after they have their basic needs met, with all the tools we have available, why are we not only unhappy, but largely depressed? Author and journalist Jahann Hari set out across the world to speak with leading experts on depression, anxiety, and loneliness to discover both how we've gotten to this place and, more importantly, how do we as individuals and a society start to turn the tide. This is my 20-minute interview with Jahann about what he learned from that research. All right, so why don't we start out with a little bit of an intro about yourself and about your work.
I wrote my book Lost Connections because there were these two mysteries that were really hanging over me for years. I think I was quite afraid to look into them in some ways. The first mystery is I'm 40 years old, and every year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety have increased here in the United States, in Britain, and across the Western world, right? And I kept asking myself, why? Why is this happening? Why are so many more of us each year that passes finding it hard to get through the day, right? And I guess I wanted to understand that because of a more personal mystery. When I was a teenager, I remember going to my doctor and explaining that I had this feeling like pain was leaking out of me. That's how I put it at the time. And I felt very ashamed of it. I felt confused by it. I didn't understand why it was happening. And my doctor told me a story that I now realise from speaking to the leading scientists in the world on this was oversimplified, right? My doctor said, we know why people feel like this. It's just because of a problem in your brain. There's a chemical called serotonin that makes people feel good. Some people are naturally lacking it. You're clearly one of them. All we need to do is give you some drugs. You're going to feel better. So I started taking a chemical antidepressant called Paxil, and I felt significantly better for a few months. And then this feeling of pain came back. So I went back. The doctor said, well, I didn't give you a high enough dose. I was given a high dose. Again, I felt better. Again, the feeling of pain came back. And I was really in this cycle of taking higher and higher doses until for 13 years I was taking the maximum dose you're allowed to take, at the end of which I was still really depressed. And I was surrounded by people who were becoming more and more depressed. So I just forced myself really to start looking into this. So I ended up going on this big journey for the book. I travelled over 40,000 miles. I wanted to meet the leading experts in the world about what causes depression and anxiety and what solves them, most importantly. So I met, not just leading experts, but just a crazy mixture of people with different perspectives, from an Amish village in Indiana, because the Amish have very low levels of depression, to a city in Brazil that banned advertising to see if that would make people feel better, to a lab in Baltimore where they were giving people psychedelics to see if that would help. And I learned a huge number of things, but the core of what I learned is that there's scientific evidence for 9 different causes of depression and anxiety. 2 of them are in fact biological. My doctor wasn't wrong. Your genes can make you more vulnerable to these problems, just like some people find it easier to put on weight than others. And there are real changes in your brain that begin when you become depressed that can make it harder to get out. But most of the factors that cause depression and anxiety are not in our biology. Most of the factors for which there's scientific evidence are factors in the way we're living. And what I learned in the process of writing the book and speaking to so many scientists is, once you understand the causes of depression and anxiety in this more complex way, it opens up a much broader range of possible solutions that I saw being put into practice all over the world. And these are solutions that we need to be explaining to people and offering to them alongside, not instead of, but as an option alongside chemical antidepressants.
Why is society at large reacting in this way? What do you think are some of the influences on people's well-being that's leading to the higher and higher rates of depression and anxiety?
Well, I'll give you an example of one of the 9 causes that I wrote about in Lost Connections. We are the loneliest society there's ever been. There's a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing this years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer, not the average, but the most common answer is none. Half of all Americans asked how many people know you well say nobody, right? I spent a lot of time talking to an amazing man called Professor John Cassiopo, who was the leading expert in the world on loneliness. He was at the University of Chicago. And he explained to me, why are we alive? You and me and everyone watching this. Why do we exist? One key reason is that our ancestors on the savannas of Africa were really good at one thing. They weren't bigger than the animals they took down. They weren't faster than the animals they took down, but they were much better at banding together into groups and cooperating. Just like bees evolved to live in a hive, humans evolved to live in a tribe. And if you think about the circumstances where we evolved, if you were cut off from the tribe, you were depressed and anxious for really good reasons. You were in terrible danger. You were about to die. Those are still the impulses we have. We are the first humans ever in the long 2 million year history of our species to try to disband our tribes. And it is making us feel awful. So a key thing for me was not just to understand these problems, but okay, how do we solve those problems, right? And one of the heroes of my book Lost Connections is an amazing man called Dr. Sam Everington, who pioneered a whole different approach based on this understanding. So Sam was a general practitioner in East London, a poor part of East London where I lived for a long time. And Sam was really uncomfortable because he had loads of patients coming to him with terrible depression and anxiety. And like me, he thinks there's some role for chemical antidepressants, but he could also see most of the people he was giving them to did become depressed again. And he could see that they were depressed and anxious for perfectly understandable reasons, right? Like, to give one of the examples I talk about in the book, loneliness. So he decided to pioneer a different approach. One day a woman came to see him called Lisa Cunningham, who'd been shut away in her home with dreadful depression and anxiety for 7 years. And Sam said to Lisa, don't worry, I'll carry on giving you these drugs. I'm also going to suggest something else. There was an area behind the suite of doctors' offices that was known as Dog Shit Alley, which gives you a sense of what it was like, just kind of scrubland. Sam said to Lisa, what I'd like you to come and do is turn out a few times a week. I'm going to come too because I've been pretty anxious. We're going to meet with a group of other depressed and anxious people. We're going to find something to do together as a group, right? The first time the group met, Lisa was literally physically sick with anxiety. But the group starts talking, they're like, what can we do? These are inner city East London people, they don't know anything about gardening. They decided they were going to teach themselves gardening, right? Going to turn Dog Shit Alley into a beautiful garden. So they start to watch YouTube, they start to read books, they start to get their fingers in the soil. They start to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's a lot of evidence that exposure to the natural world is a really powerful antidepressant. They start to do something even more important. They started to form a tribe. They started to form a group. They started to care about each other. If one person didn't turn up, they'd go and look for them. They'd see if they were okay. They did what human beings do when we're part of tribes. They started to solve each other's problems. The way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. There was a study in Norway of a very similar program, found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants. I think for an obvious reason, right? It was dealing with some of the reasons why they felt so bad in the first place. And this is something I saw all over the world, from Sydney to Sao Paulo to San Francisco. The most effective strategies for dealing with depression and anxiety are the ones that deal with the reasons why we're in such distress in the first place.
You said that we're living in the loneliest society there's ever been. How can that possibly be with all of these tools at our fingertips, right? We have social media, we have the ability to connect and interact with anybody in an instant. I can FaceTime my mom in a second, and if she picks up, then I can see her face to face. Has social media played some part in the fact that we are lonely?
This is a complex question with a complex answer. So the glib answer is to go, yeah, social media did this to us. It's just too simplistic. To understand this, I went to the first ever internet rehab center in the world. It's just outside Spokane in Washington State. It's called Restart Washington. I remember I arrived there. It's a clearing in the woods. I got out the car, and absolutely instinctively, I looked at my phone to check my email and felt really pissed off that I couldn't see it because there was no reception. I was like, oh wait, you came to the right place, right? And I spent a fair bit of time there. And it was totally fascinating. They get a whole range of people at Restart Washington, but they disproportionately get young men who become obsessed with these multiplayer role-player games like World of Warcraft, or not at the time that I was there, but now Fortnite, right? And I remember Dr. Hilary Cash, the amazing woman who runs this centre, saying to me, look, you've got to ask yourself,